The history of migrant workers in California dates back to the mid-1800s. The Mexican-American War was ended in 1848, and with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico granted over parts of its northernmost territory, including California, Utah, and Nevada, to the United States. By the end of the first half of the 19th century, 45% of Mexico's original territory belonged to the United States. During the latter half of the 19th century, Mexicans began to travel back and forth between Mexico and California, working on the construction of railroads and mines. However, it was not until the Mexican Revolution that America received the first large influx of Mexican immigrants. They moved to America for a better life. To avoid being dragged into a bloody war, many young men and women were sent to America as refugees.
My grandma's parents wanted to get her out of Mexico on account of the Revolutionary War that was going on at the time in that country. So they put my grandmother, she was a young girl at the time, young woman, and they put her on these trains that would come up north and as far as Chihuahua. And then later on, she came across the border with some families, not her parents. They remained in Mexico, and from there she came down to Chihuahua, and from Chihuahua somehow she met my grandpa there, and they got married, and then they migrated to New Mexico. And I believe in New Mexico is where he got a job in the railroad.
Like all the immigrants that came to America before them, Mexicans settled into America by performing strenuous jobs for very little pay. Many Mexican immigrants worked the cotton fields and grapevines of California's Central Valley and Central Coast, migrating back and forth each harvest season. Life was difficult for the migrant workers. Pay was low and living conditions were even worse.
My grandma was working in this cutting shed, and they had a little bit of problems. She had a little bit of problems with the boss, and he didn't want to pay her. So the next evening she went over there to the house, and these Chinese people still use the little braids, long braids, and so they told her that no, they were not going to pay her because it was her fault, and she didn't think it was fair. So she said she got her knife, and she really wasn't going. She was just threatening them, and she said, "You're going to pay me," and she was speaking in Spanish, and they started speaking in Chinese, and then she brought the knife out before them. They started running. There was a table, and they started running around all over. And she was, "Were you going to pay me?" In Spanish, and I guess they barely understood her, and so they kept going like that, and so they told her they were going to pay her, and they did, but she stood up for what she believed, that it was not fair, that they weren't going to pay her.
By the 1920s, at least 3/4 of California's 200,000 farm workers were Mexican or Mexican-American. As a result, the first labor agreement between the United States and Mexico was formed. In this agreement, Mexico required that the United States farm owners provide legal contracts for all Mexican workers, guaranteeing conditions such as fair wages and work schedules. The United States government, in turn, promised to enforce the border between the United States and Mexico, making sure that all immigrants from Mexico had the proper work contract so that they would not be exploited. However, neither party truly honored this agreement, as the Mexican migrant workers continued to live under horrible conditions and illegal immigrants frequently stole across the border. As the Great Depression swept through the nation in the 1930s, Mexican migrant workers in California suffered from discrimination and became targets for deportation. Many officials saw the laborers as a scapegoat for the poor economic conditions. California state and local governments responded to farm owner pressure and implemented repatriation plans to send Mexican immigrants back to Mexico in busloads and boxcars. An estimated 500,000 Mexican and Mexican Americans were deported, regardless of their documentation status. The Bracero program was enacted in 1942, which allowed for the legal immigration of Mexican workers to temporarily fill the farm labor need America had in the midst of World War II. The program was only supposed to last until the end of World War II, when the soldiers would return. However, the Bracero program lasted some 22 years, and during this time legally brought 4.5 million Mexicans to work in America. With the help of the Braceros, America was able to fight in the war effort overseas and fight towards economic recovery at home. As a result, the agricultural fields of America became the most productive on the planet, mostly due in part to the cheap and abundant labor the immigrants provided. The working and living conditions of the migrant workers changed little as the century progressed, and in the 1960s and 70s, a great reform movement began with Cesar Chavez as its leader. Cesar Estrada Chavez moved to California in his early teens, living as a migrant worker from Brawley to Oxnard, Atascadero, Salinas, McFarland, Delano, Selma, Kingsburg, and Mendota. In 1962, Cesar Chavez founded the National Farm Workers Association, later to become the United Farm Workers, or the UFW. He was joined by Dolores Huerta, and the union was born. Huerta was a teacher turned political activist from Stockton, California, who saw the poverty many of her students from migrant families lived in. Together, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta championed the militant, nonviolent methods of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as they led many boycotts and demonstrations for the equality of farm workers. The 1965 to 1970 Delano grape strike and subsequent boycott brought international attention to the mistreatment of Hispanic and Filipino migrant workers. Chavez and Huerta led a monumental march from Delano to Sacramento in 1966 as an attempt to present the plight of the farm workers before the American people. Again, following the example of Gandhi, Chavez announced in February 1968 he was fasting to rededicate the movement to nonviolence. He went without food for 25 days, only drinking water. It was an act of penitence for those who advocated violence and a way of taking responsibility as leader of his movement. Cesar and the farm workers believed if consumers and communities throughout North America knew about the suffering of field laborers and saw the grape strikers struggling nonviolently, they would respond. As a result, millions throughout North America stopped eating grapes. By 1970, the boycott was a success, and finally, table grape growers signed their first union contracts, granting workers better pay, benefits, and protections. Cesar and the farm workers showed ordinary people that by making little sacrifices every day, by not eating grapes, they could directly help the poorest.
In the 1940s, my father was a migrant worker. His family and him would go over to the Central Coast. There they would live in tent communities. During the spring, they would pick the strawberries and other crops there. Later on in the year, they would come back to the Central Valley, and here they would harvest grapes, cotton, and oranges.
How would you say that the migrant lifestyle has affected the Central Valley community today?
Even though my father got out of the migrant work, myself and my brothers and sisters, during the summer, we would go out to the fields and pick grapes and other crops, just like other children that we went to school with. So I believe that this has left a legacy here in the Central Valley of hardworking people.
Today, migrant workers are still facing many problems, and the fight for fair wages still carries on. However, the Mexican migrant workers, past and present, have greatly added to the wonderful diversity that California boasts. Recently, social activist Dolores Huerta was recognized by the President of the United States for her contributions to the fight for civil rights. And in the Central Valley alone, thousands of children of migrant workers now work as doctors, lawyers, and business owners while passing on the hardworking traditions that are their legacies.